My name is Jerry Vero Jr. For those of you who don't know me, I've been on several radio shows, podcasts, had some articles written both on the internet as well as the New York Post. In 2008, I commissioned a writer to write a book about my family, the Deli University family on my mother's side. The main characters, of course, were Paul Deli University, aka Paulie Lefty, and his youngest brother, Sebastiano Deli University. Some of you know him as Sonny. Some of you know him as Tony, because he changed his name to Antoni Bastiano. Depends on which world were you in. Did you associate with him in the gangster world or the off-Broadway world? Depending on that is what you called him. I've been quiet for a while now, and I've decided that I'm going to put this information out there that I've gathered over more than a decade for the public to see, because it's either that or I take it to my grave with me. Next to me here, these two binders are full of all kinds of documents. Some that I've requested on my own, FOIA request from the federal government, Bureau of Prisons, you name it. And I had an attorney help me as well, so some of the correspondence you'll see was with an attorney. It's an obvious conspiracy going on with my great uncle for whatever reason. I've also got hundreds of emails here and another binder from Hollywood celebrities, gangsters, most of which who were retired. Only one had enough guts to actually go on camera for 3 hours, which it turns out is my good friend and who just recently passed away, Mr. Tony Napoli. He went on camera for 3 hours, told details about my uncle, admittedly things that we didn't know when we originally wrote the book, which made his story even stronger. And now that Tony has passed, I want to get this story out there because he was part of a project we were working on together. For those of you that know Tony, he had his book, My Father, My Don. I have my book, For Members Only. We were working on something independent of that because Paulie Lefty and Jimmy Napoli were actually partners in the gambling business. A lot of people didn't know that. Well, I'm going to put this information out there, and I have some things that are going to blow you away. Example being right here. This is a Freemason certificate. This is what you get when you become a Freemason. As you can see, I blocked off the name because I'm going to decide when I'm going to reveal who it is. But I'm going to take a wild guess and say I may be the only person in American history that's ever actually proven that a mob boss was a member of the Freemasons. It's been, said, Freemason, Illuminati, and all that, but no one's been able to prove it. I can, and I'm going to show it. Since my book has been out, there's been a lot of validation that has come forth. A.J. Benza, been on his podcast. He's come out to reveal what he knew about Paulie through his father. His father was like an Elliot Ness, okay? Actor Ed Lauder, through some of his own research through the FBI, there's a video out there that I want some of you to see, where he says on camera during a documentary that we did together that the FBI pretty much told him to go away and stop searching for who this guy is. And you're going to see a lot of that in this information that I'm going to be showing you. I've also been contacted recently, people wondering, how do I know some of the mob figures that I know? Because I'm only in my 50s. How do I know some of these guys? Well, in 2013, this book came out called Mob Boss from Jerry Capici, featuring Al Diarco. Well, what happens in this book? He mentions a lot of the players that were only known to the locals in Little Italy, for the most part, that I mentioned in my book 5 years earlier. Check it out. Buy them both and see if I'm telling the truth or not. For Members Only was first published in 2008, revised in 2012. Mr. Capici's book, 2013. I was 5 years ahead of him, okay? Names like Jimmy Alto. We were the first ones to reveal that Jimmy Alto was the real boss in Little Italy. He answered to no one, not even Lucky Luciano. Guys like Sammy Chalemi, Colombo Saggesi, Charlutz, which was Charles Gagliardotto. We mention him in this book, and it was reiterated. So Mr. Capici, who a lot of people consider one of the, renowned experts on the mob, unknowingly validated my book. So that's another reason why I decided to put it out here. But a lot of people are also asking me, why me? Why am I doing this? I'm the great nephew. Well, I never planned on writing a book about my great Uncle Paulie. I just kind of fell into it. Now, how did that happen? Well, first of all, in an organized crime family, and a lot of you will confirm this out there, sometimes you're too close to the main figure, sometimes you're a little too far away. So if you're a son or a daughter, you're not going to know shit. And a lot of books out there will tell you that Albert DeMeo had no idea who his father was. There's plenty documenting that. Then you're a little bit too far away. I was kind of sitting in this perfect spot because my grandmother Sadie, who's Paulie's older sister, who was the matriarch of the family because their mother died very young, that's my grandmother. Now, we lived in Valley Stream, Long Island growing up. My grandmother Sadie and her husband Tony Guma would come over to my house every day. No one would argue in my family that Sadie and Tony were the heads of the family. They were the oldest, they were the most respected, and they probably knew the most. Well, in addition to hearing them over talk my whole life, we see Uncle Paulie a lot. So every Sunday, we would go down to Little Italy. There was a restaurant called Marbona, no longer there. And then we'd walk down the block afterwards to my uncle's cafe. He had a cafe called Cafe Caravella, right next to Vincent's. This was once a week. My grandmother Sadie, who came over our house every single day in Valley Stream, New York. When I come around the corner from school, my grandfather would be leaning against a chain link fence with a beer in his hand. I'd walk inside, and the smells were awesome. My grandmother would be helping my mother cook. That was 7 days a week. My grandmother kept her hairdresser in Manhattan. Even by now, she was living in Queens. So I would go there with her now and then. I obviously wouldn't hang out in the salon, so I'd walk over and I'd see Uncle Paulie and my Aunt Anna and whatnot. In addition to that, my father had a butter and egg route in New York City. So every day, not every day, 3 days a week, in the summer especially, I would go with him. We would stop Valley Stream, stop in Queens, pick up my grandfather, go to Manhattan. We would start off on the west side, hotel, bar, butter, we'd pick up our butter and cheeses and everything like that. And of course, around lunchtime, guess where we would wind up? In the Little Italy area to eat. Why not? My Uncle Paulie was always around. He was either standing outside his club, in his club, he was somewhere. And of course, we'd say hello. So I overheard a lot of things. There's too many stories to get into, but I'll give you an example. We're sitting at Puglia's eating, and wasn't a limo, it was a Lincoln Town car, pulls up in front of my uncle's apartment. Whoever got out, my grandfather knew who it was, and he tells my father, "Oh, that's a big shot from Brooklyn. He runs this, that, the other." I don't even remember his name. "What is he doing, Dad?" "He's going up to see Paulie." "Really?" "Everyone answers to Paulie, Jerry. He's a top man." Top. I remember hearing that as a kid. Then as a teenager, I used to hang around a lot with my Uncle Sonny, okay? He was a cool guy. He was like one of us. You could do anything in front of him. He didn't care. He was a super cool guy. So I was always doing well. I had a car, so I would drive him to certain places around the city. We'd go to different type of social clubs and other places. He was picking up money for my Uncle Paulie. So not only was he chewing my ear off, and I could ask him any question I wanted to, he would tell me, but I would meet some of these other old-timers. At the time, I didn't know who they were, I have to be honest. You gotta understand, the family I grew up in, it's just another Italian guy. It's an old Italian guy, that's it. I didn't know who he was until a month later, 6 months later, 2 years later, I see him getting arrested on TV. The acting boss of this, I'm like, oh shit, I met that guy. I met a lot of them through my Uncle Sonny. We would go in there, sometimes I would sit down and they would give me a sandwich and a soda, and they'd be talking among one another. I would pay attention. They really didn't care. They realized I was Sonny's great nephew, and they knew I wasn't going to get involved in the mob because my Uncle Paulie would never allow it. If he found out I was on the books, he'd take me off. So they would yak, yak, yak right in front of me. I was paying attention. And what I remember is they would talk loud when they wanted everybody to hear something, and then they would kind of whisper right afterwards. What I found out that was is they were giving out disinformation. They knew there were rats from the very beginning, and they would so-and-so, and they'd whisper something. I'd overhear those things on top of the fact Uncle Sonny told me. Now, my Uncle Sonny was what you consider a connected guy. He was never a made guy. He didn't have to be made. Being made is not the honor everybody thinks it is. When you become a made member of the family, that means you're beholden to people above you now. If you're a soldier, you're kicking up to the captain. Then the captain's kicking up to the boss. If you're an independent, you do whatever you want. You don't have to kick back to anybody. Sonny was able to do that because of his brother Paulie. But yet, he knew everybody. He knew all the players, and he was trusted. You could look this up because he spent over 20 years of his life in prison. Just Google Sebastiano della University. For drugs, by the way. But he never ratted. So the fact that he didn't rat, when he came out and I would go with him, he was just out of jail, he'd go to a club or something, he would go in and everybody would kind of back up because they don't know if the government is following him or whatever, but they trusted him, okay? And they were able to talk in front of him. Later on, in the early 80s, we moved to Southwest Florida. I lost some contact with the close family members. But here it goes again. Now I fall into something else, unintentional. My Uncle Jimmy, who was Paulie's other brother, who worked with him in the numbers business but never spent a day in jail, had a place on the east coast of Florida. I don't want to say where it is. So I went over, I would visit him, and at this point in his life, it was about the year 2000, he was only allowed to have 3 cigars a day. That was the doctor's limit. Or maybe it was my Aunt Lena's limit. I'm not sure who gave him the limit, his wife or the doctor, but he could only smoke 3 cigars a day. He would go out to this terrace, and I would go with him. And he started talking about my Uncle Paul, and he never spoke about him when he was alive. My uncle was already dead since '94. Paulie Lefty I'm talking about. He would talk about him. And he would say things that didn't make sense. Yeah, I remember Paulie would send me and Jimmy the Blonde over to Puerto Rico. So first I'm wondering, what are they doing in Puerto Rico? And Jimmy the Blonde, I believe, was a Lucchese guy. He started mentioning all these names, and they were players from different families. So I said, Uncle Jim, why does Paulie have some type of authority over all of the families? Because different people you're mentioning are from different families. How is he dictating who's going with you and whatnot? And he says, because he's not with any of the families, he's with the Sicilians. I didn't know what that meant at the time. Tony Napoli cleared that up later. I didn't know what it meant. But I knew he was a powerhouse, and I knew everything that Uncle Jimmy was telling me is the truth. Because he didn't like to watch mob movies or mob shows. He didn't want to watch The Sopranos. I lived it, he said. And you know the way Sicilians are, a lot of you out there, they're stubborn. He won't watch it just for the principle of not watching it. That's the way he is. He never watched any documentaries. He never watched any of that. So the information I was getting from him, I knew, was his experiences and not what was told on TV, which I found to be very inaccurate. So I'm going back and forth there every year, and he's feeding me more and more information on top of what I've already known my whole life. Just imagine what my parents knew, my mother and father, older than me, growing up in the same existence. Around my grandfather, Nana Sadie, Poppy, Tony, all the relatives. Think about what they knew. You don't think I heard stuff from them? So I go back every year with Uncle Jim to talk to Uncle Jim. Then in 2005, I get invited to this celebrity golf tournament in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. I'm working with a couple of lawyers because for an occupation, I'm what they call a public insurance adjuster. Like an attorney, I represent you against the insurance company when you have an insurance claim. But I need lawyers because from time to time we need to push it all the way to court. So I get invited to this tournament by 2 attorneys, John Lakin and Ken Lakin. Now John Lakin, he's already well known. He was on court TV. before it became True TV. He was because he was a criminal lawyer for a long time in Boston. He worked for Joe Marchese, a mob lawyer. So he was asked about the Michael Jackson case, the Casey Anthony, all the big cases on national television, right? John Lakin he was very well known. Ken Lakin was a part-time entertainment lawyer. He represented people like John O'Hurley, Tom Arnold, Ed Lauder he worked with, and some others. So these attorneys that I'm associating with, they're not from Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe on the corner. They're both very respected lawyers. So they invite me to this celebrity golf tournament in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Who do I meet there? Hollywood actor Ed Lauder. And I'm with my father. So we meet Ed and we hit it off right away. The first celebrity I ever met. And he was so cool with us. He heard the New York in our voices. And that's where he's originally from, Eddie. He's from Long Beach. And he associated with us right away. Well, during the day we would play golf. At night there was a big banquet, live music, food, this, that, the other. So we sit down with Eddie and he starts asking us questions. We start talking. In the middle of the conversation, he says, yeah, my good buddy, Tony Lip, used to run the door at the Copacabana. And he starts telling stories about the Copa. So my father points over to me and he says, his mother had a sweet 16 party at the Copa. She sat in the front, 1964. Paul Anka sang to her. So Ed's like curious, well, how did that happen? How did she get, her Uncle Paulie was a big shot. And I actually saved that here, which is pretty cool. Here is the official Copacabana from 1964. This thing is, what, 55 years old? Okay. And there's the inside. Okay. That's my mom, my grandmother, cousin, grandfather, all at the Copacabana. I got some good stories about that. So they're continuing that conversation, and Ed thought, he says, you know what, we were filming a movie, The Waterfront with Marlon Brando, and I heard rumors that they had to get permission from somebody named Paulie before they can film that. Could it have been Paulie Lefty? My father says, yeah, probably, because he had a lot of influence on the docs. Okay, so we're talking back and forth, and he says, so what do you guys want to do? A book or a treatment or something? And we start laughing like, Ed, what do we know about writing a book? And what the hell is a treatment? And he says, well, these guys can help you, and he brings the attorneys over. So that's when it all really started. That's when I realized, okay, I'm going to have to write a book here. So of course, John Lakin helped out with a lot of the criminal records, or lack thereof. Ken Lakin set up something in New York City, so we can start interviewing the family members and see what more information we can get it on paper. Well, after this celebrity event, I come home to Florida. My wife informs me that a relative of mine died. So I says, okay, is it someone that I'm close to, that I know? She goes, yeah, it was your Uncle Jim. So here it is again. Me and my Uncle Jim were talking a lot about Uncle Paulie, and he mentioned several times a book. We got to do a book on my brother. They need to know who he really was. Never took it seriously at this point, but it popped in my head again. Uncle Jimmy mentioned that. So of course I went up to New York. I'm living in Southwest Florida now. I went up to the funeral. Who's there? My Uncle Sonny, last living sibling. Now I knew my Uncle Sonny would have even more stories because he spent over 20 years of his life in prison. Uncle Jimmy didn't spend a minute in prison. I told Sonny, my Uncle Sonny, what me and Jimmy were doing, and he says, let's do it, kiddo, let's do it. And that is when it all started.